Today, cybercriminals are taking advantage of an expanded attack surface to commit malicious activities ranging from hijacking user accounts to making fraudulent purchases. Businesses need solutions that can protect their sites from this increase in fraudulent activity. reCAPTCHA Enterprise is a frictionless fraud detection service that leverages our experience from more than a decade of defending the internet with reCAPTCHA and data for our network of 4 million sites. To learn more about how reCAPTCHA can defend your website or mobile application against fraudulent activity, visit securityweekly.com/reCAPTCHA. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences' next-gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys to learn more.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. We are looking for high-quality guest suggestions for all of our webcasts to fill our Q3 recording schedule. Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and submitting the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Learn how hidden vulnerabilities lead to application compromise in our next webcast with Sneak. Our second June webcast will be with Google Cloud, teaching you how to prevent account takeover attacks. Register for our upcoming webcasts or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcasts or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. Matt, John, it has been a month. It was episode 107, the last time we had a news segment. So we've been busy talking with having a lot of great interview segments, which is good. But it does mean we need to catch up on quite a few bits of news.
We're a little behind.
We got a bunch of great stuff to cover, but still there's so much that we've unfortunately had to let drop in the cutting room floor.
Yeah, a lot of stuff being dropped, but I'm definitely pulling my host privileges to call out a direct path traversal attack vulnerability. So this is in Zoom. So Zoom has had a definitely some ups and downs over the last few months in terms of their security model, and the overall trajectory is positive. This one was just very interesting to me because it was very easy to understand right up and very simple. So it's a feature for Giphy so that people could actually have entertaining chats and basically think of it as a usability or a user experience type of feature that introduced a very simple directory traversal vuln when trying to retrieve images from the local file system. And so that's why it stood out to me. And it did have some aspects to it that means it wasn't fully, you couldn't run quite arbitrary executables or arbitrary files on the file system. Still consequential, and it did call out a very ancient NTFS, alternate data streams, which that's something from late 90s, I think. It was the hacking technique of choice or of curiosity when you're playing around with the double decode vulns and the code red types of attacks. So I thought that was kind of fun, just from a AppSec history perspective.
Well, with all the GIFs in our Discord channel, I hope Discord doesn't have the same vulnerability.
and it's funny, that's sort of what I was thinking about, actually, because at first this was reminding me of we saw an issue at Teams, right? I think the last news segment we did. And on the very top surface, it almost sounded like it might be related, but no, it's different. But that's I mean, I guess you need chat in your video screen sharing stuff, but okay.
Why
well,
not?
and it's going to follow the Jamie Zawinski rule, and eventually it will just also support email. Like every application just ends up supporting email. But yeah, but I think I guess one other comment there, then we'll move on to our next victims, was that it's just interesting also that user-generated content introduces a lot of risk. And the one GIF, the Microsoft Teams one that you mentioned, John, that was a way that it was actually just the GIFs themselves are actually being used as a vector for leaking cookies. Out of domains that could be impersonated. In this case, the GIF is actually the mechanism for supporting, an attacker to provide a ... basically an arbitrary path traversal to get to something on the local file system. So there's a lot of different, those are two very different types of threats just from supporting a one type of capability.
Yeah, they sound similar at first, but yeah, no, don't. I'm not trying to suggest that they're copying code. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
We just
yeah,
all need
yeah.
to,
I think
we all need to go back to using teletypes and smoking in the office.
There we go.
Oh, we missed those
And
days.
ASCII-based emojis. Yes, exactly. All of our images will be ASCII and 80 characters wide. But so that's the past. But the future, speaking of the future, is also moving towards some privacy protecting techniques that Apple had introduced with their Sign In with Apple. So Sign In with Apple is definitely not unique. You've had it with Sign In with Facebook, Sign In with Twitter, LinkedIn, Google, of course, is pretty pervasive. And they're essentially, an overlay of OAuth or OAuth 2, hopefully. In this case, there was a nuance in the way Apple implemented it, is that you could also provide your name and essentially a proxy email address rather than your direct personal email address. And the intention being that way different apps couldn't start to correlate or triangulate your personal data based on the unique identifier, the mostly unique identifier of your email address. What happened here is that with the sign-in with Apple, you could essentially obtain a JOT, a signed assertion that says, oh, your identity is tied to this email address. Apple servers will sign that JOT, and then you turn around and take that token, present it to the third party you'd like to authenticate to, and the third party says, oh, well, thank you for providing me a token that's been signed with Apple. Everything is good here. You might as well go along. Come on in. And so it opens us up to the potential for an account type of takeover attack. And it's essentially, we'd also talked about JOT 6 or 7 weeks ago. In this case, it's not really a problem within that itself. It's more a problem that there were some assumptions made both in the sense of the identity of the user and whether they are actually associated with that email address that they're purported to be as their identifier, and then how the server would validate and match not just the signature to say, yep, this assertion is valid, but also match that to the user that's presenting, that subscriber is actually the person they say. So hopefully I didn't, that explanation kind of made sense, and I didn't lose you all. So what do you guys think about that?
Now, what I couldn't tell, Mike, in this one is, does this work? Because there's two modes, right? You can share your email address or you don't share. And when you don't share, it creates kind of its own unique token. Is this only an attack when you don't share your email address and the token is assigned, or does it work in both scenarios? That's what I couldn't understand.
It is a good question. And my read on it, if I do understand it correctly, it is definitely the vulnerability comes out of using that email proxy. So when you don't want to share your email, in that way, then they're working on, here is your proxy foobar123 at redirect.apple.com email address. So that's really where more came out of. And there were two write-ups I included here. One was the initial write-up talking about finding the 0 day, which is just another term for found a vuln. And then the other write-up does also take a tone about don't roll your own auth, but does shed some light on what the underlying issue was, more so that it's not really just a JOT problem. It's more of how this workflow is implemented. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad implementation. It's just obviously there's some testing and some assumptions that weren't fully the assumptions that were made that weren't backed up by robust testing, and a way just to make it easier for the third party to understand how and when they should what identifier they should use to authenticate the person.
So did you just tell us that Apple should not get into the identity game?
I think Apple should continue to get into the identity and in their privacy preserving manner, or I shouldn't necessarily say preserving, but I'm coming up with some other alliteration. But I'll just say, keep going. Mistakes were made, to use the passive voice here. But overall, this is not a bad direction to be going. Speaking of directions, though, and good or bad, we do have another article about Apple. In this case, it was about a recent fix that I think I'm going to get my numbers mixed up, 10.13.5.1, I think, that was basically fixing a kernel memory corruption. And this is to fix what was a jailbreak that was in the news only about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think. So again, just interesting to see that the types of vulnerabilities. Let me just say the range of vulnerabilities that Apple has been working on the last couple of weeks while we've been missing them in the news.
Yeah, this was interesting. First, at least to me, it seemed like the guys, they must have been obviously working on this for a while, the exploit. Soon as as you said, 13.5 came out, or 13.5.1. It was 13.5.1, right? They had the jailbreak. Like, they announced it the day before a release, and then they're like, we got it. So, that was either some pretty sharp work that they were doing right at the end, or they had something that they were brewing on for a while. But what was interesting about this was a few interesting things. They were expecting Apple to take weeks to be able to patch it, right? And I think Apple had the patch out, probably about a week?
Yep.
Yeah, I have to check the timeline.
Yeah.
So it was pretty quick. But then sort of, the really interesting thing to me, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what the vulnerability is here, but they didn't just release that patch for iOS. There's also a patch out for, well, obviously tvOS and the rest of the iOS family, or loosely coupled iOS family. There's also a patch out on the macOS side. So this is something in general with the kernels that was going on with the Apple product line, which is, when you start seeing patterns like that a little bit bigger, it's, code reuse isn't always a great thing. So that's interesting to see.
But it can be in particular cases too. In this particular case, right? We've always had this perception, I think, maybe that Apple was more secure than Android, and you can debate whether it is or isn't. What I think is interesting is the ecosystem works in Apple's case to not only fix it in iOS, but in Mac as well, and get those patches out very quickly, and boom, everybody can be upgraded and standardized with the fix. Where with the Android ecosystem and the hardware interdependency play here, it's a lot harder for Android to be this quick and get patches out across a very diverse hardware infrastructure.
Yeah, and actually, that's one of the things I wanted to also just touch on when we did talk about like the Zoom and the other Apple disclosure, is that this really talks to we'll say whether or not you're accelerating your patch cycle, both to fix vulns when they are disclosed or to you, as well as when that patch is available. So in the Zoom, it took about, I think, 5 or 6 weeks if you look at the timeline from initial notification to the fix being pushed. But Zoom also just disabled the Giphy support in the meantime before the fix was out. So they actually didn't have, it wasn't a full 6 weeks of exposure for their end users. They actually were able to do a temporary inoculation, if you will, and then get it out. And in this case, as John was pointing out, I think it was like 7 or 10 days between the release of the vuln, or the announcement of the vuln, to the patch actually available for download onto all of your Apple devices. So positive aspects in that timeline. Mm-hmm. And I think, speaking of time, I think that's going to be a quick segue into one of the other articles, John, that had caught your eye over the last couple of weeks. And this was the aspect of a focus on speed doesn't mean focus on automation is the headline. And I want to throw it over to you. And what stood out to you on this one in particular?
There's a good report from Newstack. They'd run one of their surveys a while ago, and this is the results out of it. So the two big things there were, orgs that focus on speed tend to make more mistakes, and orgs that focus on, quality of their code tend to release slower. Okay, that's, As I usually jokingly say, news at 11. We know that. That makes sense. But what was interesting to me was that the orgs that are releasing faster, from what they found in the survey, was those groups had, and this is my word, not theirs, but less respect for testing. So they actually, those that they were talking to that wanted to go fast were just saying, if we're going to basically QA and prod, and then if we find something, since we're pushing out changes so quickly, we'll just fix it. That's the part that seemed off to me, because when I think about, and this comes back to Apple, right? So thanks for a segue on this, or really anybody. But as your development cycle and release cycle becomes faster and more efficient, and you can test more automated, have more automated testing, and do that testing in an efficient manner, efficiently. What you start seeing is, you have more confidence in what you're doing, and you're able to actually, you don't have to do it every time, but when you do have the, oh my God moment, you can say, well, let's just release it out and let it happen quickly. And you can do that. So to see some of those orgs, it was their thought process around this, right? And then the second point that was interesting in there was the, those who didn't have as much testing were saying that there was a lack of dedicated resources. And, I spent the last few years of thinking about not how do I get rid of the QA team, but how do I have the QA team merge into the dev team, so as dev is writing new code, they're writing new tests. So to hear someone say that they need test resources seemed incongruous, at least the way I've been thinking. So it was an interesting article. The initial, the surface results were sort of, okay, I get it, but as you think about it, it became interesting.
Yeah, I think there's an aspect there too that ties into when we talked about the service reliability engineering, the Google ebook that came out just a few months ago, and I think that definitely ties into this aspect too, because the idea of an SRE is how do we focus on quality and availability and ensuring uptimes? What's our service level objective, and how well are we meeting it? And you need quality code and testing to be able to keep your app from being brittle. So yeah, you can fix it in prod when you find the problems quickly, but there's also the aspects of, what about the baking time for new releases, that you find vulnerabilities problems may not emerge until on one pod, until it gets maybe to multiple, or you start to get to cross-region type of deployment, and then there are certain complex factors that come in. So I think I like that idea of not getting rid of the QA team, but shifting them into the dev team, and just having that combination of dev and testing be more front and center on all of everything they're doing.
Well, we talked about a little bit on this last segment with interactive testing, right? I mean, that is potentially kind of that combination of dev with testing and using those interactive tests to validate aspects of your code quality as well. And I think that's still where the big challenge is.
And actually, there's GitLab just released a developer survey about about that challenge, about testing, and I think this ties into your article, John, as well as what the last segment, how you point out, Matt, so the developer survey from GitLab, it was talking about who's responsible for security. That was the main thrust of it, but it also had some comments around, like, a solid majority of developers are not running SAST, DAST, or container scans, and only about half are conducting compliance scans. So that's an interesting observation of the data, but I also kind of question, is the implication there they should be running SAST or DAST, or is it also maybe an implication that SAST and DAST isn't meeting what developers' needs are, and maybe IAST or something else is the tool of the future for them?
So you just opened a can of worms. Where do I start?
Yeah.
Look, you know this, Mike. You wrote one. DAST is tough, right? It's tough. Black box testing is tough. Okay, end of discussion. I do still believe there's value in SAST, but maybe the value diminishes over time. We were talking about the commoditization aspects of testing, where I can see commoditization coming in is at SAST and SCA longer term, because I think as you move more of static analysis and software composition analysis into Git or into the repos or whatever, we could see that happen, right? But I still think there's value there. The question is, how much are you going to spend for that value versus what you're going to get out of some of the other tools, okay? So, that's the SaaS desk discussion. IaaS sits in the middle. Again, we were talking about this a little bit, and we've done a segment on this too, where interactive testing and building out different test cases, where you have understanding of the app to test out different aspects of the code, has value. I think it's still very difficult to do broad-based interactive testing at scale, and I think that's where some of the challenges still are.
Yeah, and there's a couple other things that I think kind of help build your case. So they were talking about, they had some other 60% of developers don't actually run SaaS, 73 don't conduct DAST. But that's also, there's a couple different ways that could be interpreted. One is that, yes, DAST is hard, but it's also, if these tools just start to show up within the developer pipeline, they become commoditized. And your point, like SaaS and SCA, then the tool, they'll just start to appear, and it's really easy to make those numbers improve. And the other thing was that 47% of companies say testing is the number one reason for delays. And that testing is what we've been just kind of hammering on right now, is that's where you can put in your IAST, and that's where you put in your security testing. That's where your QA group can come in and work with developers to improve that quality. So it's just kind of interesting that kind of maybe it's a disconnect, or just that conversation that the DevOps teams and the security teams are having about, well, sure, we know we need security. We're not using it, and maybe we're not sure where to put it in, and maybe we say we need it, but even if we're not just doing testing for our quality, we need to have that conversation too, in addition to testing for security.
Yeah, well, and I think the first who's responsible is more telling, right? It's all. If you look at the results, it's all over the board. It's a quarter, right, depending on who. Mm-hmm. I think 29% got it right, which is it's everyone's responsibility in some form or fashion. I think what we're still navigating in the application security side is when you look at all these different potential testing areas, how that gets distributed across the entire CI/CD pipeline from build to ship all the way out into the run side. And so I think there is a lot to, it's everyone's responsibility, but it's at different places depending on where you are in the process. And we're still seeing the kind of the slow integration of these different security testing tools into that pipeline. And so I think this is still going to take some time, but you read the first sentence of this article and you're like, well, no wonder we're struggling with this.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting too what like the shared responsibility that cloud service providers have been saying. So it's not like just saying who's responsible for security it's a nice start, but it's just too generic, because security does mean so many different things and touch on a lot of different points along that CI/CD pipeline, as you pointed out. So it's sort of pulling apart to say, everyone's responsible, but where are they responsible? Who's ultimately accountable? And as well as the idea of the security team perhaps being more of that consulting effort for the DevOps team that actually is fundamentally responsible for the code they're building, as much as it would be they're responsible for the availability of it, the uptime.
Yeah. And I think this is where, sorry, John, just quickly, this is where the interesting cross-section of DevOps and this concept of DevSecOps comes into play, I think, longer term. Security, I think, provides more of a governance versus an operational role in this longer term. I just don't think most security teams are ready for that yet. They still think of the operational side of security and haven't fully transitioned over. I could be wrong, but I've seen this kind of trend moving where security plays more of the consultant, provides oversight, but you kind of let the DevOps teams do their things and get that code out, so you reduce friction, but you still got that security overlay that's still kind of making sure things are still secure and maybe compliant if it's in scope.
It's where was it going to go with that? Oh yeah, so what you're saying there is interesting, and Mike, what you said actually earlier is you led into this, sort of caught my ear, and when I was looking through the report, because I haven't read this one in detail yet, container security scanning. Okay, this is my background. We know this space, right? But to say that, when I initially hear people say that they're not scanning a container, I'm like, oh my God, that's so simple to do, right? You can either pay for it. There's plenty of vendors out there. We know of a few of them. You can get open source packages. Why would you not just do this? And then I started thinking, and like I was on a friend's podcast last week, cybersecurity and cloud podcast, and I was listening to some of the back episodes, and they had been talking about a university where and we've all seen this, but I'm just telling the story because it brings the point. University goes and starts doing vulnerability scans, and they're like, oh, great, we found 500 things. What the hell do we do with that? And it's part of that too, right? We can add these tools in here, and especially talking about the SAST and DAST. I mean, those are historically thought of as noise generators, right? So I think a lot of this comes down to, and I think we're just starting to see this with some of the newer startups. Don't just tell me about it, but what can you do about it? Can you patch some of this low-hanging fruit? Can you help me prioritize that? I know there's some orgs like Ken has been doing that for ages, but how do we? It's great to bring more tools in here, but we don't want to be doing deception against ourselves. To tie it back into the previous segment, right? How do we actually really find that needle in there without just creating more hay?
Yeah, that's a good point, because there's another, and I don't want to put an over reliance on just what the actual raw numbers are in these percentages, but there's also a comment with the DAST is that less than 14% in this case, or let's just say a small number, we're giving developers access to the reports from the DAST tools.
Wow.
And one way you could interpret that is maybe they're just that team is triaging it, so they're saying, don't look at the raw report, look at the report that we're going to give you that will remove any false positives that might be there. But more importantly, look at the report that revolves around the things that we think you should fix that you can fix. So there might be that aspect too, is that we're running the tools and here's what's actionable for you. So hopefully that's the case. I'm definitely being optimistic there and forgiving in that interpretation. But it just kind of points out to that idea, I think, more that larger about who's running the tool and why aren't developers just running the tool. And I think that's kind of an underlying theme we've been touching on for at least the past year, and let alone the previous segment about how does this fit into where the developers are working.
Yeah. There's room for growth there. Probably room for another startup.
Yeah, I know where they're working. They're in their IDs, they're in their build tools, and they're not looking at security tools.
But one of the thoughts across my, to share the inner workings of John's head, one of the, careful everybody. One of the thoughts I was, toying with earlier today is the concept of spell checker for security in an IDE. And I know some of those tools out there exist. But yeah, it's not just purely about shifting lefts to get the OPSI type thing down, but can we do something to actually help the developers, not just give them a tool, but actually result in help? There's probably a play there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but yeah, need to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing more the red squiggle or blue squiggle underlines in whether it's just your cloud configurations, like, hey, here's your Terraform or your YAML, what have you. That would be fantastic, let alone just in the code as well. And then the one other quick thing that I wanted to other article is about why abandoned domain names are so dangerous. And this actually, we had a very brief conversation about this. Matt, you kind of posed this question, and as well as how is this really something to worry about in this day and age a couple weeks ago. And so here was a article that was talking about at a high level about just a problem of what could happen with abandoning domains, subdomain takeovers, and essentially seeing that we live in a world where applications are, it's port 443, just like Philip was reiterating in the last segment. And with those domains are getting cookies. So they're your authentication if the cookies don't have HTTP only tag on them. But the domains are also be using for CDNs. So here's loading your JavaScript, your other resources, as well as those domains are holding user-generated content. So anytime that an attacker can have a control of a domain or a subdomain that has a security barrier associated with it or security context associated with it, that's a bad thing. And there's also some aspects too of just using domains as part of phishing attacks. I'll set aside that just since it's still related, but not so quite directly AppSec related. But just wanted to throw this article out there and highlight that for you and for our listeners.
Thank you.
As well as my cat, who's very, I'm not sure if you can hear him or not, but he's quite vocal on this topic. So just wanted to make sure that we got that covered.
Consider it covered.
I mean, think about it. Domain names are, unless you're going for some really weird TLD, the domain names they're super cheap to pick up and renew and all that type of thing. Why would you let it go for $20 a year? I mean, it seems like what might be interesting, again, tying this back to previous segment, thinking about deception and monitoring. Maybe these things exist. I haven't done serious DNS management for ages, but to have like a utility where you manage all your DNS names in there, and then the ones you aren't using, you still renew them, but you put them out somewhere and just honeypot them and see what happens. I'm just full of ideas today.
You are.
Full of ideas.
You need to give that one to Paul because he's got to figure out all of our domain subdomains and what he's bought and what's abandoned and not abandoned. So you guys can work on a side solution, I guess.
Can't wait.
There we go. That's it, John. That's your homework for the week. So we'll be keeping you busy. So while John gets busy on his 3 new startup ideas, I think it was, and as well as working on his working with Paul on fixing all of Security Week, these domain names, and Matt goes off onto all the other podcasts we've got for the week. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Matt and John, as well as everyone here who's been listening and saying hi in our Discord channel. Thank you again. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.